Hey, Mark Dickey here. Just a quick little overview of using Zbrush from a beginner point of view. Just focusing on some of the core features, but specifically looking at the workflow for a blocked-in approach. And so what I mean by a blocked-in approach is when you want to make a character, instead of just jumping in and sculpting and treating it like clay right from the beginning, basically blocking in your design. And so you're working with primitives. So we're using the insert multimesh tool to insert spheres or whatever shapes we want and reshaping those to be these core shapes using as minimal tools as possible, just essentially using the move brush and a bit of scaling or move translating to get our core shapes in quickly with a focus on getting nice clean geometry, clean, strong plane changes, and nice, just clean flowing geometry that isn't bumpy and lumpy. Very common mistake. So you can look at the feet down here. This is an example of it having gone wrong. Likewise with the horns. Both of those were made just as a sphere that was dynameshed and then sort of extruded into shape. And it's quite tricky to get the shape correct. Whereas if you're just starting out with these primitive key forms without worrying about detail and just getting nice smooth flowing geometry, once you've assembled the whole character like this and then you Dynamesh, it's very easy to then turn that into a character that has this high stylized look with very clean flowing shapes. It's just a matter now at this point of coming through with your sculpting tools and using things like pinch, detail tools to come through and sculpt in the various bits you want. They'll give you a much cleaner result. So this is, a work in progress, but you can see it's much cleaner than for a beginner mentality of what you would sort of get if you would just sculpt it. So what you see a lot of people do is jump in. So here I have a Dynamesh sphere. Just increase the resolution a bit. And so a lot of people will come in and basically just grab a move tool and just kind of start trying to form a general shape of a character. And a lot of people, and there's nothing wrong with this, it goes extremely well. A lot of people make some amazing artwork working purely through Dynamesh and using the move tools. But the problem with this workflow, especially when you're fairly new to it, but also if you're trying to make stylized characters specifically, is that it's quite tricky to get something that isn't ending up bumpy and kind of messy. So what I'm trying to do here is just quickly demonstrate the wrong approach for a lot of beginners, and where a lot of beginners make mistakes is getting this sort of, you can see already it's starting to get this kind of bumpy kind of effect. Yeah, so let's say I'm trying to just quickly block in, get the shape of a character. Now I could spend time on this and it will end up looking good. There's nothing wrong with that approach. It's just that it's not a very fast approach. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of understanding of your primary forms in order to get a nice clean result. And you're probably better off just learning a workflow that's built around speed. And so let's say, like this guy, I'm just making a bust and I'll start doing some facial features. It's not going to take long before you end up with something messy. You can see we're starting to get some pretty difficult shapes forming. And basically, I don't have a whole lot of control over the forms that I'm making. I'm working in a very minimal kind of approach. And like I say, if you spend the time with it, it will form the shapes, the forms that you want, but it's not going to be quick. A better mentality is thinking about just blocking in with primitives. So I'm just going to make a new scene and I'll start with a polysphere. Now by default this polysphere has subdivision levels on it, so I come into under the tools panel, geometry, we can see that it has multiple subdivision levels. I can scroll through those and we can see it's much lower. In order to use the insert multi-mesh, so I'm using Shane Olson's brushes here. These are the same as your standard insert multi-mesh, it just has some extra brushes added. But in order to use these, it won't let me add with subdivision levels. So when I select my insert multi-mesh, and I press M for mesh, it brings up which mesh I want to use. If I pick on one of these spheres and go to do it, it tells me I can't have subdivision levels, and it cancels that action. So I just need to come in to geometry, delete lower. So we got rid of those subdivision levels. And now I want to add, so if I treat this as basically the skull section, and we're going to add a jawline. It's a perfect sphere at the moment, maybe I'll squish it a bit. So we'll just drag down, selecting that square to squish that shape. Just hitting Q to get back out of that. Now I press M and select what mesh I want. I'll make sure I got symmetry turned on, so I can press X to see those red circles. You really don't want to do this and start working asymmetrical. That can be a problem. You also want to have the floor turned on initially, just so that you're understanding which direction you're facing. You don't want to have this off and just be trying to make things randomly. It needs to be, ZBrush is very particular about which direction it's facing. It's a critical skill. It's just standard professionalism that your object is always facing in the correct direction. So we hit X to get our symmetry, and we can see those two red dots, and then when they get aligned into the exact center, they become one dot. So I'm just going to click and drag. I can rotate that object as I go, or I can hold down Shift as well, and that tries to snap it. Doesn't always work well, so I tend to not worry too much about it. Now when I move this, so it doesn't really matter what we make, we can scale it, move it, whatever. So you just want to be fairly quick. When I move this sphere, it's really important that I don't just go at a random angle and what looks like the side, but I actually hold down Shift as I orbit and snap it to the side. So the reason for that is if I move it at a slight angle, what can happen is you get this distortion. If I hold down Shift and snap it, I'm only moving on the Z and Y. I don't want to move this direction. So I'm snapping to the side, I'm just moving it, scale. Basically forming a generic sort of jawline type shape. Not too worried about specifically what I end up with. Partly because this is just a quick demo, but partly also because I'm simply going to come in with a move brush and start shaping it myself. So I'm going to grab a fairly large size brush. We want to make big changes. Don't focus on details, whatever you do. You need to be starting out small, keeping it simple. And this ensures that you get a nice clean flowing geometry. So this is representing the jaw section of the character. And this basically gives us a nice clean eye line that we can work with. Okay, so I'll just quickly add a couple more. So M, I click on a mesh. We might add maybe an ear. And grab the move tool and just kind of squish it. Because it's symmetry, they're moving towards each other, but that's not a big deal. We can just reposition those. I just want to reposition my gizmo. So if I unlock it and click reset orientation, and as long as this is unlocked, I can move it. Now I can lock it again, and we're back here. So I'm going to orbit out a little bit. I'm not too worried about exactly how this works. Might just scale it a bit. and come to the top, and we'll just orbit a bit more. Thinking about the position, maybe something like that, and then we'll come in with the move brush, and again, pretty big brush, and just make generic changes. And so remember, this will all be combined into the one mesh, so you're just trying to think about where you want your flow, the flow lines. Okay, pretty crazy looking ears, but that'll do. We'll give it a nose, so M. I'll just use a sphere for the demo, so it's very similar to ZBrush Core. So I've made a sphere. Just going to stretch it out a bit, then use the move brush with a large setting to just try to get a bit more of a sort of compressed kind of shape. And this is where it's really useful. If you go to the side and click on the gizmo icon with the move tool, it changes it from the gizmo to the transpose tool. What you want to do here is just draw a line from the start to the end. If I click on the orange, I want to go to this middle circle. If I click on the outside one, which is the orange one, all it does is move the whole gizmo. What I will want to do is click on the inside one to actually activate the function. So you have to be in move mode. Now if I click on this one and click and drag, it just moves it around. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is hold down Alt and click and move, and that gives it a nice bend. I'm trying to get, let's see, what I'll do is go with this sort of shape and then just spin it around. And I'm not being too particular because I'm just trying to get the general sort of gist of key forms of what I'm working with. Just smoothing there a little bit. So there's our nose. Now the eyes. Insert a mesh. W to position those inside the skull. But what you really want to do with the eyes is move those onto their own layer. So I'll come into the subtool menu. So using this insert mesh method, anytime you make something, everything else becomes masked. So as long as that is masked out, I can come down in the subtool menu to split and click on split unmasked points, which will remove anything that's unmasked away from those. Or I could click on split masked points, which will literally do the opposite. It'll move anything that's masked away from the unmasked bit. They both have the exact same effect. It's just, it's going to make which one's on top different. So you can see that's made the spheres, because they were masked, it's moved those apart. All right. Okay, so what's happened here? When I've hit undo, I've actually duplicated the whole mesh. So if you accidentally do that, select what you don't want and click delete. Very simple. So I'm back to just this one mesh. The eyes are selected. Sorry, the eyes are unmasked. Everything else is masked. So now click this button, we have the eyes on a separate layer. So if you ever end up with something you don't want, splitting them to a different layer is a really good way to go. So for example, if I make a mesh and go, whoops, don't want that. Maybe this is like some horns or something that I've sculpted and then decided, no, it's just not working, or perhaps I've accidentally duplicated those. Just make them masked, and then what you can do is split them out to their own layer. You can double check which layer is which by selecting it. You can turn off the other layers. Oops. So we can see, I'm looking at these bits that I've made. Of course, the fact that they're colored. So with this layer selected, I'll delete. In order to do that though, of course, you need to be able to select different groups. So let's say what I want to do is select the head and make some changes. In order to select things, different polygroups, you come into the Move tool, hold down Control, and click. So I can click the green group, that's moving that whole group. I can click the blue group, which is the nose, just by holding down Control and clicking on those. Then I come back to the Move tool, and if I want, I can start making changes to that geometry. But let's say I decide I want to get rid of the ears. At the moment, I can't select just the ears because they're in the same poly group as this. So what we need to do at this stage is auto group. So if you come down to poly groups, and this is very similar to ZBrush Core, it just has extra options. And this is full ZBrush version 4 release 8. But if you come into your poly groups, the very first option is auto groups. And I click that, and it resets everything. I'm just going to hold down Control and drag to get rid of my mask. Just be aware if you do that with Dynamesh turned on, you're actually going to Dynamesh your mesh. You don't want to do that. You don't want to turn it into one mesh just yet. Okay, so I've got poly groups. With my Move tool, I can now come through and select individual bits. But really what I want are the ears to be in the same group. In order to do that, I need to hide everything. Being able to hide things in ZBrush is quite critical. So the way you hide things, unlike Select, with Select you have to have the Move, one of these Move, Scale or Rotate brushes selected. You hold down Control and click. For this to hide things, we don't want this on. We need to be in a brush mode. So I hit Q, which puts me back to Draw. Alternatively, I could just click on a brush. So I'm in a brush mode. Now what I need to do is, let's say I want to hide everything except the ears, because what I want is to put the ears into the same group. I need to hold down Shift and Control. If I'm holding down both Shift and Control, the first thing I click on, hides everything except it. Still holding Shift and Control, if I click again, it hides that piece and reveals everything else. Now that I've initialized this hide mode, as long as I hold down Shift and Control together, anything I click on will be hidden. So I just go through and hide those bits. I can release Shift and Control. Of course, we're only worried about the current layer that we're working on, the current subtool, so that I can ignore the eyes. I could even hide those. So now that I can see the two ears, and I want those in the same group, we come back to our Polygroups menu. Polygroups. This is where we clicked on Auto Groups. But this time what we want to do is Group Visible. And the keyboard shortcut for that is Control W. So I click Group Visible. They're now in the same group. I can hold down Shift and Control and just click out here. And that gives me everything back. Control drag to unmask everything. Grab my Move brush, I can now select just the ears. If I decide I want to move them, I can make those changes. Maybe they needed it to be scaled a little. Maybe I've decided he's going to have goblin ears or something completely different, and I want to just simply delete those. So I might just split those out to a different group. And so that gives me my ears. I actually had the wrong thing selected there. That brings me to mesh. Let's say I've accidentally, what I wanted to do was put the ears on their own layer. I've accidentally put the head on its own layer. If I want to bring that back, as long as it's directly above the layer I'd like to merge it with, I can come down to merge, and there's this option to merge down. So it's going to merge this layer, which is this head, down into this layer. So select the layer I want, come down to merge, merge down, merge down, hit OK, and now they're back in the same layer under the subtools menu. So once again, what I want to do is select just the ears, everything else is masked. Come into split, split unmasked parts. That gives me the ears just on their own. Then maybe I've decided I want to get rid of them, I could delete them. Perhaps I'm not sure. Maybe what I want to do instead of deleting is hit duplicate. Then I could turn off that layer, come down to here and go, okay, I'm going to do a little experiment. Make some adjustments. Let's say, like I said, I wanted goblin ears. So I might just grab the move tool, make my changes. Probably more like elf ears, whatever. And just look at it and go, oh, actually I've changed my mind, I don't like that. Or maybe I'm undecided and I want to compare that to the original. I can just, as long as I'm not on the layer, any layer you've selected is always active, is always visible. Anything else is dependent on these eyes. So what I can do, these little eyeballs is visible. I can turn on the normal ears, or turn them off and turn on the goblin ears and compare the two. And then make a decision. Let's say I've decided I like what just happened, by the way, was I had the normal ears selected, and it doesn't matter that is turned off because I'm on this lit layer. It's always going to show them. So I select the goblin ears, and let's say, okay, actually I do like those, I'm going to go with it. I can get rid of these if I've decided I've had enough. Don't leave them in there. I could always save this out, by the way, as a different tool, and incremental save, so I can come back to it. But what I want to do is get rid of those ears. So with that layer selected, delete. Okay, and they're gone, and I'm left with these. So your layer management, your subtools, it's not really layers, they're just different subtools. It's the Zbrush terminology, but managing your different subtools is a very critical skill, as is working with polygroups. You need to be able to select it, so hold down Control and click on the things you want. You need to be able to hide them, so go into draw mode, hold down Shift and Control and hide the things you don't want. And then if I want to merge these into the same group, I can go Control W, or just click under my polygroups. Control W is simply group visible. That lets me select just those bits. And that's really it. That's about the fundamental skills that you need, is being able to hide things, being able to select things, being able to work with subtools. It's all about mesh management. It's pretty basic once you've got the hang of it, but when you're new, it can be a little bit confusing, because this is kind of different to how other programs, especially 3D apps like Maya, do things. So just practice that. Practice going through, making different objects. Just make a silly little face, give it some horns maybe, figure out how to quickly get in there and shape the basics of it. Don't spend a whole lot of time trying to get it perfect to start with. Just spend time focusing on how to quickly manage your mesh, get the shapes you want. And speaking of horns, this gives me a good example of sometimes you'll want to actually go into Dynamesh. So let's say I want to make some sort of intricate horn shape here. This sphere's not really going to work. It'll be fine if it's going to be like big bunny ears or something. But sometimes you can Dynamesh if you need to. So with just that selected, I'm splitting them onto their own layer. So I come down to splits, unmasked. So I've just got these selected. With these guys, before I Dynamesh it, come into geometry. We don't want this faceting. We don't want to see the polys. It needs to be smooth. So I'm going to come into geometry and divide a couple of times until it looks nice and smooth, maybe once more. then delete the subdivisions, delete lower. Now that I've done that, I can see the geometry is pretty high res. I go into Dynamesh, I'll just increase the resolution a little and click Dynamesh. And so at this point, I've got a Dynamesh object on its own subtool. And so now I can start making pretty drastic changes because it's Dynameshed. It's pretty easy to start doing these sort of crazy shapes, because as it starts to distort, I can just hold down Control, click drag, and in Dynamesh mode, that Control drag turns into a retopology. If something is masked, it turns into a deselect your mask. So it's going to depend really on the context of whether something is masked or whether you're working with a Dynamesh object on what Control drag will do. But this is the advantage of Dynamesh. It lets you make pretty wild shapes quickly and easily. So I'm just Control dragging again to just retopologize. Anytime I sort of want to make a big change, in this case, a change in direction, it's one way to do this. I mean, with Zbrush, there's so many different ways, and typically with horns, you'd use something like snake hook to quickly make the shapes you want. But this is more about explaining that you can have a Dynameshed object in there, so it's good for hair on a character. And the final stage would be of this process. Let's say I want the ears back in with this section because I'm happy with those. It needs to be above the section that I want to merge with, or in this case I'm going to bring this one down. So these arrows, this one says shift down, the top one simply selects the next one down, whereas this one, the bottom one, the down and curve, shifts that layer down. It was up here, it's just shifted down. So now that this is directly above the ears, with this layer selected, I can come into merge down, and this will bring this layer into here. So merge down, hit OK. Now I've got all of this layer in the one layer, and if I'm ready to actually do a bit of sculpting, the same as the horns, what I can do is come into geometry, divide it until it looks nice and smooth. So I've gone pretty high res there, hit delete lower, come into Dynamesh and increase the resolution a little bit. It's kind of experimental on what sort of resolution you want. You need to just try it and see what happens. But now it's one mesh. They are still in separate polygroups, but they are all joined as one mesh. So I can turn the line off, be a bit easier to see how they're merged. And so what you do now is come in with a smooth brush and start, just turn off that Dynamesh, and with smooth come in and join it all together. But you can see this very clean, smooth geometry. And this is a really critical thing for doing stylized characters. Everything needs to be smooth and clean. You don't want bumpy, messy geometry, and that's pretty much what you're likely to get without having a ton of practice. You're most likely to end up with very bumpy geometry, sort of little features of lumps and things all over the place that you don't really want. In this blocking method, it's much easier to quickly get these core shapes. And now you can come in with your sculpt brushes and sculpt tools and start doing things like pinch, for example, is a really useful one. So if you select a pinch brush, these are custom brushes that I'm using here from Shane Olson, but there's tons of custom brushes for Zbrush around the place, but even just the standard pinch brush, it's a really good workflow for, I'll just hold down Alt, and I want the reverse. I've probably got that a bit strong, but it's good workflow for getting these clean lines. I want to increase that sharpness, I'll just typically come through and sculpt, smooth in the bits that I don't want. And it takes a little bit of work and a bit of practice to get the shapes that you want, but you will quickly get these clean lines. So here what I'm doing is using the pinch brush and then maybe softening the entrance to it, and then letting it go sharper, and then maybe softening it a little bit again down here. It's a really good method too for getting this nice clean flow. And so again, I'll soften that exit of the pinch and soften where it started. I've got a bit of a sharp point here on the face, so we'll just come through. Trim dynamics probably a bit strong. Let's just try the polish. Just gently get a really nice clean plane along the top of the nose here. Just smoothing that out. So you can see there, it's a very effective tool for giving you these quick, clean shapes. That's just so critical to stylized character work. So yeah, that's the general workflow. With a bit of practice, you can go through and get some beautiful looking characters put together very quickly. So it's very fast, and it's just, honestly, it's a really fun workflow. So hopefully this tutorial helps. It introduces that concept and those key features of being able to manage your mesh. That's probably the main thing that you need to get a grip with quickly if you're new to ZBrush, is being able to select different poly groups and merge different groups the way you want, manage different objects, different tools going into different subtool layers, having complete control over how you move geometry and position them into different layers. You know, once you've got the hang of it, it's just as quick as any other tool. Like if you're used to using Maya, even Photoshop, if you're more familiar with the sort of 2D side of things, it's very simple when you're using those tools to, say in Photoshop, to just know how to make a new layer and paint different levels on top of each other and then start blending them together. Or in Maya, how to put things in different layers, move objects. It all seems so simple and natural once you're familiar with it, but that's just practice. And this is the same as ZBrush. It's just spending a little bit of time getting comfortable with how it does things. And once you understand it, it's no more difficult than any other program. And in fact, once you're familiar with it, making characters like this in ZBrush, this is far and away the fastest way to quickly build up characters. And you can just block out complete characters in a very short period of time. You can sit there for an hour, hour and a half, and have a full character blocked out, ready to go into detailed sculpting stage. And you try and build a base mesh in Maya in the same way, it's going to take you days or weeks. So this is totally worth sticking with and learning. So good luck. I look forward to seeing some people's work. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and stay tuned for more videos down the track. Cheers.